We do know that the Kremlin reacts to signals and has generally stood down in the past in regards to this. If Western capitals were to be proactive about it, then this could have the potential to actually be very de-escalatory. One of the things that I've always believed in was a mistake the British government made, and I understand why it made that decision. Fully understand that, and to a lesser extent the Canadians and Lithuanians who were also involved, was to remove their training officers from Ukraine, those who were training the Ukrainian army, because it highlighted to Putin that if the West was not going to gauge the possibility of losing its soldiers in Ukraine, it wasn't going to defend Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're talking to the author of a new report calling for a fresh European strategy towards Putin's Russia. It was written for the think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, and describes an existential crisis for Europe, encouraging it to be bold, proactive, and destabilise the Kremlin. Dr. Stephen Hall is an associate fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and wrote the report, and he joins us now. Stephen, good to see you again on Frontline. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kate.
Your report, it pulls no punches. What is your case?
Well, I think it's quite clear. Russia, or rather the Kremlin, I should say, believes that it is fighting a war with the West, and it's time for the West to actually react. The Transatlantic security architecture, because of Donald Trump, is weak, and Europe, and Britain included in that, so you use Europe in a wide umbrella term, needs to be doing far more. One, to support itself, but also to support Ukraine during these times as America, under the Trump administration, goes back towards isolationism or pivots towards China or whatever it is that Donald Trump has decided America is going to do on that day. So there are plenty of things that the West needs to be doing. And again, I use the term broadly in terms of the West, but Europe, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan could also be included in this as well. Needs to be doing far more in terms of supporting Ukraine, but also themselves, especially the European states, in terms of dealing with Russia.
And from the current state of affairs, though, this very concept of destabilising the Kremlin might put Europe on a collision course with the US, which, if anything, is getting closer to Putin.
It's potentially possible under Donald Trump, and we simply don't know which Donald is going to appear on which day and what he thinks. We're seeing that he's having criticised Zelensky. He now is criticising Putin. So maybe he changes by the hour in some cases. It could potentially lead to a infraction between America and Europe. That's indeed true. But really, this is existential to Europe. It is on their doorstep. Ukraine is the largest European state in terms of the European continent. And what Russia is doing in Ukraine, if it is given a green light and succeeds in Ukraine, then Europe can increasingly expect to see further destabilization by the Kremlin in European states, potentially the Baltics, but also Finland and Sweden, Moldova possibly, and depending on how much of Ukraine is annexed, if we follow the Trump peace proposal, where Ukraine will have to recognize de jure the loss of Crimea and de facto the loss of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, then it could also lead to more Russian incursions in the future into Ukraine. Sergei Shoigu, the former Russian defense minister today, has said that Russia should expect Europe to attack it in 2030. Now, generally, when Shoigu, along with many other of his peers in the Kremlin, says something, it means that Russia is actually the government is thinking about it themselves. There is plenty of ink being spilled amongst European security organizations, pointing to the fact that the Kremlin is already rebuilding Russia's army. It is preparing for another incursion somewhere else in the next 3 to 10 years. And really, Europe needs to, especially with America no longer being the backstop to European defense, needs to be doing far more, and it needs to act quickly, especially in the countries west of Warsaw.
And beyond the obvious, you mentioned it, obviously, the Ukraine. How else is Russia threatening European security other than by armed conflict?
Well, we can see it in terms of what it's done in supporting far left and far right political parties and politicians, the Kremlin isn't choosy in terms of ideology. Any group that could help destabilize democracies in Europe is beneficial for the Kremlin. It has been funding these political parties for a long time, trying to engage in changing opinions in referendums. Whether it's been successful is another matter, of course, but it's certainly been trying for a long time. We've seen in terms as well of what's been happening with the war in Ukraine that there have been attempts at sabotage in Europe with attempted assassinations as well. That seems to have all the hallmarks of Russian special operations being undertaken. So these are two examples I can give, and there are many others as well.
And in your report, you've set out a 5-point plan, 5 strategic pillars to destabilise the Kremlin. And we can go through those in a moment. But what I'm interested in knowing is why would you want to be open about this, lay it on the table, because it could be exactly the kind of ammunition that's needed by the Kremlin to continue asserting that European NATO countries are a threat.
I think potentially it could be, but I think that the Kremlin has been doing it for a long time in terms of asserting that NATO is a threat, that Russia is at war with Europe or America or the Western world. The Anglo-Saxons, America and Britain, are public enemy number one. Increasingly, it's the French for a while, and Macron seemed to be potentially leading a European force into Ukraine. Briefly, it's been the Germans. So this has always been there. It doesn't necessarily provide ammunition, I would say. The Kremlin will always have that ammunition in its own mindset, and it will continue to portray the West as the enemy, regardless of whether this report is published or not. What this report sets out to do is try to convince or precipitate the debate in European capitals about the need to actually start going through these processes, or if they have been started, to be ramped up very quickly. Europe needs to be ready. This isn't just a conflict on the periphery of Europe. This is existential to Europe. We have benefited from the international world order, rightly or wrongly, since the end of the Second World War. And European politicians need to tell their voters, need to tell their publics that this really is existential, that if Russia is able to succeed in Ukraine, it will try everywhere, it will try in other places, and therefore will try to threaten the international order that has benefited our lives for decades. And therefore, European capitals need to be undertaking these moves now, and they also need to be engaging in trying to destabilize the Russian government and preparing, as I've written in other reports as well for the Henry Jackson Society, preparing for a future Russia, because Putin isn't going to be here forever. He will eventually leave the Kremlin, whether that's through protest, whether that's through he finds a potential successor, whether it's horizontal, he will be leaving the Kremlin at some point. And the West needs to be ready for that day, to have a plan for a better, if you want to call it that, Russia of the future.
Well, let's have a look at your ideas in that plan in some detail. And you start with the concept of squeezing the Kremlin's resources with economic warfare, as you describe it. How successful has it been so far, and what scope, if you describe what it is and how it can be built upon?
Well, economic warfare involves the sanctions that have been going since 2014 and were ramped up in 2022. It has been successful, certainly. The Russian economy has been put onto a war footing, and that is what is keeping the economy going. But sanctions have been successful. They have squeezed Russia's ability to get technology. They've squeezed the ability of Russia to be able to trade with other states. So in that respect, sanctions have been successful. They always take time. The point of the economic warfare is this is also, as I say, preparation for European states having to deal with what happens if Donald Trump builds a good relationship, a bromance, if you will, with Vladimir Putin, and America leaves the sanctions regime, it leaves supporting Europe and Ukraine. Europe needs to then maintain and tighten the sanctions. It needs to enforce secondary sanctions. The European Union has terrific economic potential, and Britain as well, of course, combined, to be able to weaken or maintain the Russian economy in a weak state as it is, but also to actually enforce those sanctions and to, as I say, bring in secondary sanctions against other countries that want to have access to the European market but are hedging their bets and supporting Russia. One of the other things that I've also talked about in the report is that Europe needs to finally make a decision about Russia's frozen assets. For a long time, we've heard that it's illegal to take Russia's frozen assets, but at the same time, we've heard that it's okay for Ukraine to have the interest of those frozen assets. The point is that the interest also legally belongs to Russia. So if it is okay for the assets of Russia, the interest of Russia's assets, to be given to Ukraine, then logically it's also possible for all of Russia's assets to be given to Ukraine. Ukraine, apparently, according to reports that are out today, could potentially default on $2.6 billion of loans. Why not allow Ukraine to use that money to be able to support its economy, to be able to support its reconstruction, hopefully after this war, and also in terms of building its military? This is something that Russia or the Kremlin should have to pay for its war on Ukraine. Another thing as well put out in the report is to brain drain Russia's economy, to entice more Russians to be able to come from Russia in terms of allowing high potential individual visas in terms of Britain, but elsewhere in Europe as well. But also for those Russians who have fled to places like Armenia, Kazakhstan, where have you, closer to Russia, allow them to be able to travel on to European states and elsewhere in the West, and allow them to settle down, make it easier for them to integrate. It would also undermine the Kremlin's propaganda about Russophobia in the West, that the West is Russophobic. If it turns out it's easy for Russians to travel to the West, it's easy for them to set up a business, it's easy for them to open a bank account, find accommodation, these sorts of things, they will ring their parents, they'll ring their families back in Russia and say how easy it actually is. This will start to undermine the Kremlin's propaganda about this. And finally, one of the things I think Europe needs to do is to cut remaining trade ties and also to finally reduce energy dependence on Russia. European capitals have found ways round the energy issue regarding Russia, and increasingly there needs to be more that's done from that. That they can't. Places like Hungary and Slovakia have had nearly 4 years now, to work out how to get round to not be dependent on Russia for their energy. This needs to change as well in terms of the thinking.
I'm just interested in what you said about the brain drain, trying to attract people to leave the Russian Federation. You yourself say that President Putin is not going to be there forever. Wouldn't it be better for them to stay there and to be the next generation, the people to prepare for the future?
That's a great question, Kate, and it indeed could be possible. And it's one of the things that this report doesn't have all the answers by any means. It's 12,000 words, and I'm looking forward to feedback from people like yourself and as well, just comments. But certainly, I think that there can be this attempt to, yes, if need be, keep people in Russia, but to highlight that these people who may not necessarily agree with the Kremlin haven't been abandoned. There is this, by allowing them to travel, by making it easier for Russians to get visas, by allowing them to integrate into Western society, what have you, it at the very least highlights that the West, it's not the West against Russia per se, it's the West against Putin. Western governments need to be very clear. This is not a war, or this is not a destabilization of Russia per se. It's the destabilization of the Putin regime, of the Kremlin, because the Kremlin has been certainly behind what has been happening in regards to Ukraine, but also in regards to Europe. And so this is one way to highlight that when Putin is removed, Russia does have a future. It's not that the West is trying to destroy Russia.
And to that point, your second pillar is to support Russian opposition and dissent, both inside and outside Russia. How and who and how unified is that opposition?
Well, the Russian opposition has historically had a major problem, I would argue, with unification. There have been different groups within it at different times, and Unfortunately, as often happens in autocracies, there is naturally a lot of suspicion within these groups as to how close they are to the elites, how infiltrated they have been by the security services. And they are, of course, competing for Western finance in many cases. And so they need to come up with the greater narrative in order to keep the money flowing, those sorts of things. Another report that I've worked on for the Henry Jackson Society that came out as well earlier was the need to unify the Russian opposition. And what I showed in that report was that with the exception of one organization that I'm not going to name, most of the Russian opposition, at least in the diaspora, are fairly united. They have common purpose and these sorts of things. One group wants to work by itself, and good luck to them and fair play. Other groups are more likely to are moving towards unification, at least in some aspects. So it is certainly a difficult thing. A lot of the opposition is abroad now, it has to be said. And that is always a difficult thing when there is opposition outside of an autocracy rather than being inside an autocracy. Increasingly, we are seeing greater repression in Russia. The number of foreign agents has gone up astronomically. The number of people accused of treason has also gone up astronomically. So Russia is becoming ever more repressive. In some ways, and this goes back to allowing Russians access to the West, it gives a safe haven to the Russian opposition to start developing their own plans as to how they can actually achieve a better future Russia when Putin leaves power. And this is certainly something that Western capitals can provide and support, not only in terms of supporting the Russian opposition, but in terms of supporting Russian media abroad, who have a far greater reach through things like YouTube and Telegram. The Western governments can provide support in terms of financing for VPNs, mirror sites, and various other aspects as well. And as Alexei Navalny, the late Alexei Navalny showed, Russians don't necessarily protest because of politics, but they protest because of elite corruption. And so, again, one of the things that Western governments can do is support the Russian opposition to find cases of elite corruption and to therefore try and foment protests in Russia, potentially, but also to highlight that Russians who don't necessarily agree with Vladimir Putin aren't abandoned in Russia. That's also very important. And again, goes back to what we talked about in regards to the brain drain as well.
Perhaps one of the most striking of your suggestions is for Europe to go on the offensive in the cyber domain with covert operations, supporting sabotage efforts by partisan groups in Russia. Can you describe the kind of operations and the scope and the detail of what you mean?
Well, what I mean really is it might not necessarily be possible in what de jure legally is the Russian Federation, although there are organizations that do at least allegedly seem to be there. So I'm sure Western security services have far more information about the likelihood of their existence than I do. But if they do exist, potentially that could be there. What I mean more in the report is the bits of Russia that aren't legally part of Russia, i.e. Crimea and the other 4 regions that I mentioned in Ukraine. Certainly Western governments or Western security services and military can provide more support for the Ukrainians to be able to disrupt logistics and defense production in these regions, and also to promote sabotage efforts in these regions. More can be done, certainly, but that needs, again, to be worked out in more detail.
So you're talking about potential attacks, not necessarily in the Russian Federation itself, but perhaps in territories that Russia might occupy or Russia might claim to be it, but not legally be defined as such.
There has been instances of sabotage within Russia, from the bombing of railway lines in order to bring trains down, bombing of bridges potentially as well, and setting on fire of military commission officers. So there are potentially sabotage efforts going on, and those should be supported as well, because ultimately Russia has been doing this to the West, and it's now time for the West to engage in this. It is a way to destabilize the Kremlin. But on top of that, and perhaps more importantly, the most logical thing to do would be to carry out cyber attacks against Kremlin-controlled networks, banks and media. And also, as I said, and this links into the media aspects, to conduct psychological operations as well within society, but more importantly, within Putin's inner circle. Again, you want to highlight to the autocracy, and when I say the autocracy, I mean the elites, the personnel who make up the regime, that ultimately there is support coming from the West. The West has a potential idea as to what could actually happen in the future if Russia was, or the Kremlin, sorry, was to row back on Putin. So if Putin was to leave office, there is a potential for a future relationship with Russia, between Russia and Western capitals. At the moment, yes, the West is seen as public enemy number one, but a lot of Russian elites, and my understanding from people who have conducted this research, is that there is this sense that the Ukraine war is wrong, that it has taken too long. Putin has done very well in many respects by giving a lot of businesses to those around him, and Russians have got richer because wages have gone up, because they're building more things in terms of tanks and weapons and machinery, and in terms also of soldiers' wages have also risen astronomically, $2,000, I believe, a month at the moment. So Russians have got better off, but ultimately Russia hasn't been able to suborn and subjugate Ukraine, and there is this sense in the Russian elite that the war is wrong. If Western governments were to provide an alternative that could say, well, if Putin was to leave power, and if you were to start negotiations, or at least provide compensation for Ukraine, then potentially we could, in the future, row back on sanctions. We could start to open up, and this could lead to a talk of a new security architecture, i.e. a START missile treaty. Not saying that Russia should join NATO straight away or anything like that, of course. But the point is that this would be a way to maintain a divide within Putin's inner circle. At the same time, Western elite security services need to be talking to Putin's inner circle and to let it be known publicly that they're doing so, because this will create paranoia in Putin. Let's say that someone in Putin's inner circle comes to him and says, well, I just received a phone call from British MI6. Unlikely, I know, but who knows? That would cause paranoia in Putin, believing that if this person has spoken to MI6, then other people must have spoken to MI6, but they haven't come forward. And so he's more likely to start to become even more repressive within his circle and start to weaken the ever decreasing number of people close to him.
But on the point, though, of going on the offensive in the cyber domain, what about the fact that being open and about strategy along those lines could be anything but escalatory? By its own admission, NATO has previously accepted that hostile operations in the cyber domain could potentially trigger a response in self-defense. Why wouldn't Putin do the same?
Well, I mean, I would argue that Putin has been doing this anyway, and that NATO hasn't reacted in regards to, we've seen it multiple times. I mean, in 2009 with the attacks on Estonia, we've seen multiple cyber attacks perpetrated by organizations that turned out to be part of the GRU or the SVR, two of Russia's security services, in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and the West did very little about it. There is always the potential that the Kremlin will react, and this is by no means certain that it won't. But we do know that the Kremlin reacts to signals and has generally stood down in the past in regards to this. If Western capitals were to be proactive about it, then this could have the potential to actually be very de-escalatory. One of the things that I've always believed in was a mistake the British government made, and I understand why it made that decision. Fully understand that, and to a lesser extent the Canadians and Lithuanians who were also involved, was to remove their training officers from Ukraine, those who were training the Ukrainian army, because it highlighted to Putin that if the West was not going to gauge the possibility of losing its soldiers in Ukraine, it wasn't going to defend Ukraine. We saw this with the USS McFaul in 2008 in Georgia, when George W. Bush sent it to Poti, a Georgian naval base in Georgia, and the Russians stopped their offensive in regards to the Russo-Georgian War of 2008. So, yes, there is always the potential for escalation, but the Kremlin has always relied on signals coming from the West, and when those signals have been seen to be strong, it has de-escalated quite quickly.
You advocate actions to weaken the Russian Federation's influence over its neighbours as well, particularly former Soviet republics and countries in Central Asia. Can you tell me how you see that working?
Well, I think one of the important things is to by weakening Russia, it would allow those countries that have been suborned by Russia or perceived by the Kremlin to be part of Russia's sphere of influence to be able to extricate themselves from it. Moldova is moving towards the EU and NATO potentially, but needs support in terms of economic support and military support. So there is more that the European states can do in terms of providing economic support to Central Asian states in terms of infrastructure and investment, and also in terms of places like Armenia and Georgia and Moldova that I've already mentioned, in helping them extricate themselves from Russia. So it is all very much a purpose of getting involved, being involved, weakening Russia, and therefore being able to reduce its influence in the near abroad. And therefore, by reducing its influence in the near abroad, it's no longer able to exert control over the governments of these states.
And your final pillar is to shape global perceptions, to isolate Russia. And you could argue, though, on the other side, that Donald Trump, while not necessarily trying to isolate Russia, has recognized his need to stop it from getting closer to China in particular, but also Iran and North Korea.
Well, certainly Donald Trump has recognised this. He's trying to do a reverse Nixon, which was when Richard Nixon broke the Soviet Union and China by not aligning with China, of course, but breaking the ties between China and the Soviet Union. So Donald Trump is under the belief that he is going to be able to break Russia's influence or Russia's relationship with China. I don't necessarily buy into that in terms of how successful Trump is going to be. I think the relationship between Russia and China is far too close for America to be able to do that, and it would need probably a generation, if not more, for anyone in the Kremlin to move closer towards America than it would towards China. But this isn't necessarily about Iran, China, North Korea. It's more the wider global South. There has been a lot, and understandably, of course, a lot of sitting on the fence in regards to global South countries, and I hate the term, but we have to use it in terms of Africa and Latin America and Asia. And one of the things that can certainly be done is to try and peel these countries away from Russian influence in terms of further economic development support from Western capitals, and in terms as well of building up a strategic cooperation, possibly with China, but more importantly with India as well.
And as I understand it, you are not about breaking up the Russian Federation. You've already said that, but more about weakening Putin's grip on power and undermining his ability to wage war. But in your view, then what? What next? Because bar a black swan event or his death, realistically, he is in power for as long as he chooses, right?
Well, realistically, he's in power, at least constitutionally, until 2036, or he has the potential to be in power until 2036, constitutionally, I should say. Of course, he may change the constitution again, as he did in 2020. But who knows? In 2036, I think he will be 92, if my memory serves me correctly, which would make him very old by Russian male standards, especially. So, yes, there is that potential, but again, as I said before, Western capitals need to prepare for the future Russia. They need to get their foot in the door when Putin leaves the Kremlin. However he leaves the Kremlin, they need to be ready. They need to have a plan. One of the things to precipitate that is to support Ukraine to win this war as quickly as possible and negotiate from a position of strength, but also to be ready for what seems increasingly likely is going to be the case, where a settlement, if it is Donald Trump's peace proposal, is enforced on Ukraine, or Europe is left to support Ukraine with the Trump administration either moving towards Asia or doing its own thing, whatever that thing may be. So it is certainly necessary to get European capitals to start considering these things and to actually be more proactive in terms of how to deal with Russia. Russia is Europe's biggest threat. That seems to be increasingly clear in my mind, and that it has been engaging in military aggression, cyber warfare, political subversion, energy blackmail, and economic coercion for many years. And it's time that European capitals actually started to do something similar in regards to Russia. It will weaken the Kremlin if these strategies are undertaken, and they're undertaken fully. And this will hopefully precipitate the change in the guard, as it were, in Russia. But of course, Western capitals need to be ready. And as I said this before, they need to be talking to the Russian elite and providing for a future that the Russian elite can buy into without Putin.
Dr. Stephen Hall, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.